Hello, I want to welcome you once again to the website areyounoble.com or YouTube channel, depending on what you're watching, where we are learning and I am teaching the noble, grafted in middle position, a position that finds itself in conflict with the dispensational position and the covenant theological position. And this is for one reason. The dispensational believer has detached Israel from the church. The believing Gentile is somehow separate from what God is doing with Israel. They're detached. So therefore they take the Old Testament and make it primarily for Israel. And they've created this age of law and age of grace, church age contrast, which is hard to find when you study Ephesians 2, because Ephesians 2 says that the Gentile believers no longer separated from the commonwealth of Israel. Say no more. And then the covenant theologian has flatlined all the covenants in the Bible. The covenant with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and David, the new covenant with the tribes of Israel, and started with this new covenant called the covenant of grace that starts in Genesis 3 after the fall with Adam's disobedience, and flatlines the entire Bible. Every covenant is basically erased. The distinction between covenants are erased. There's only a covenant of grace. And so therefore, this is based on some covenant that was made between the Trinity before time, called the covenant of redemption. But what we want to do is talk about the covenants that the Gentiles were strangers to. In Ephesians 2, we see where the Gentiles before the death of Christ were strangers to the covenants of promise. The covenants of promise were given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs of Israel. The patriarchs of Israel were given irrevocable promises, and those promises are tied to the land. Those promises are tied to the people. So we want to introduce you to the covenants. We don't want you to be strangers to the covenants that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But today I wanted to concentrate on the gospel. Today I wanted to show you where the word faith is easily understood if you'll simply make a distinction between Abraham and Moses. So when we think of Abraham, we think of God revealing himself or offering something to a man named Abram, a Gentile. And by faith he believed God, and by faith God declared him righteous. So the offer was God, the response was man. Abram believed God, and God declared him righteous based on that belief. And also we want to think 430 years later, a man named Moses was called by God. He even revealed his own personal name, Yahweh, to him, as he called Moses to lead the people out of Egypt. And when he led the people out of Egypt, he formed this nation according to Deuteronomy 32. That would be the apple of his eye, would be his inheritance, his allotment, because he had disinherited all the nations of the world in Genesis 11. And now he's bringing one to himself, and that one will bring the Messiah, and that Messiah will come back and liberate these people. But in the meantime, the Gentiles were kind of hanging out there until Jesus, God himself, came and died on a cross and fulfilled the law, which was described in the written ordinances as a wall of hostility between the Jew and the Gentile, between the circumcised and the uncircumcised. So the good news, the mystery that was not revealed in the Old Testament, now revealed through the ministry of Paul, is that the Gentiles would be no longer, the word no longer is key here, no longer separated from the covenants of promise, no longer strangers or aliens to the commonwealth of Israel, no longer separated from Christ, no longer without God, without hope. Where did this start? This began with a man named Abram. And I need you to contrast Abram, promise, God's character. I need you to tie the word faith to the word promise, like Paul does in Romans 4. Romans 4 is the go-to chapter for the gospel, for what faith means. Faith means that you're not trying to be declared righteous by works of the law. Faith in the Bible, when spoken of, is not referring to anything about Moses and the law, which condemns. So Paul contrasted Moses' works of the flesh and the law that condemns with Abraham, apostrophe S, faith, trust in God the Father's character, who cannot lie, who made a promise, an irrevocable promise. And not only to Abraham, but his son, Isaac, and his grandson, Jacob, who would no longer be called Jacob, but would be called Israel. So we have a man named Abram, no longer called Abram, a man named Jacob, no longer called Jacob, and we have Gentiles no longer strangers to the covenants of promise, no longer alienated from the commonwealth of Israel. There's direct parallels there. Anyway, so we need to understand what is faith. And what I need you to do, I need you to understand this. This is really important. You cannot separate Abraham, the teaching that Paul has on Abraham, from the teaching that James has on Abraham. This is crazy. This is really crazy to take the same man, Abraham, who's the father of our faith, who's the person who's declared righteous by his faith, by God, who has an entire chapter, Romans 4, and then we could go on, Galatians 3, Galatians 4, Hebrews 6, Hebrews 11, 2 Corinthians 3 is against Moses, and on and on. James 2. So let's not separate the teaching of James, the half-brother of Jesus, from the teaching of Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles. This is crazy, crazy, but we've done it. Trust me, we've done it, and you'll see it soon enough. So what do? We separate Moses from Abraham. We separate faith from works. They're two different covenants. We don't flatline the whole Bible with one covenant called the covenant of grace. The promise, Romans 4:16, stands on grace. If you want to use the word grace, it's opposed to the word law. It's opposed to the word Moses. It's opposed to the works of the flesh that condemns. Grace is tied to the word promise. Actually, the word promise rests on grace because it's not works of the law. You have to contrast Abraham and Moses to get this right. To understand this position, to be an adherent of this position, you can't flatline a covenant all the way through the end, and you can't separate Israel from the church. You can't do either one. You have to say, okay, wait a minute, let's look at this. James says that faith without works is dead. Faith alone does not save. James, the half-brother of Jesus, tells us faith apart from works is dead. James, the half-brother of Jesus, when referring to Abraham, teaches us clearly we can see that faith alone does not save. Must be accompanied with works. Does that sound like the Reformation? Nope. That's because the Reformation flatlines all covenants. The Reformation does not contrast Abraham with Moses. Faith with flesh. Promise with law. There's no contrast there. There has to be a contrast for you to understand the noble grafted in middle position. You must understand the promise to Abraham came 430 years before the law was given to Moses. Therefore, God would be breaking his promise if a man had to keep the law in order to be declared righteous. Paul says, hey, Abraham was a Gentile. Abram was a Gentile when he was declared righteous. He became a Hebrew. He became the first Hebrew convert. So therefore, don't make these Gentiles be circumcised. Abram was declared righteous before he was circumcised. Now these guys, these Jewish leaders were under the law for 1,500 years. They were proud to be followers of Moses. So Abram stripped that back and he said, let's go 430 years back. Let's look at the patriarchs. How was Abram saved? He was saved by faith, not by works of the law. And James is saying that faith that Abram had worked. Faith without works is dead. Faith without works is useless. The hope that was produced by true and genuine faith produced works. So we need to start teaching that true faith works. Let's not separate James from Paul. Let's separate Moses from Abraham. Let's get it right. Abraham lifted a knife to his son and said, God, you'll have to raise this son from the dead in order to keep your promise. Because you promised me many offspring. I tried it with Eliezer. I tried it with Ishmael. You didn't like that. So I trust you. You'll raise Isaac from the dead. I trust you on this. That's saving faith.